Now moving on to the muscular structure of the shoulder. This anatomical model, it's the right shoulder, and you're looking at it from the front. There aren't any muscles on this example here. What you see are ligaments, and there's a couple tendons. So I'm going to point out from the tendons that you see first, and then I'll explain where the other muscles are that are not represented on this figure. So first, it's probably one of the most important parts of your rotator cuff, and it's called the supraspinatus muscle and tendon, and you can see it right here. So the supraspinatus tendon attaches on the outside of the humeral head, and it travels on top of the humeral head and then underneath the arch of the acromion. So what I'm going to do to the model here so you can see, I'm going to move the arm downward. Okay, this is a motion that we call adduction. And it's going to, quite literally, not just on this model, but on anybody's shoulder, it will create more space underneath that arch. So when I move the pencil through that arch, you can actually see this is the path of that supraspinatus muscle and tendon. So it's running through and connecting on this aspect here. And when I turn it over, and you can take a look from the top, that tendon is running underneath that arch, and it's the muscle. The muscle is living right in this little space. And this space here is called the supraspinous fossa. That's where the supraspinatus muscle lives. So continuing on with the rotator cuff, that's one of 4 rotator cuff muscles. Another one is just underneath the supraspinatus is the infraspinatus, and this is on the infraspinous fossa of the scapula. So this muscle actually has a lot of bundles, and it's almost like this fan. It looks like this. So the fibers run in this direction, just like my fingers are. And then what they do is they collect into a little tendon, traveling on the back of the shoulder, and then attaching just behind that supraspinatus. Another one of the muscles on the back of the shoulder blade that makes up the third component of the rotator cuff, it's called the Teres Minor. So the Teres Minor is definitely smaller. It's probably the smallest of all 3, maybe, of all 4. It probably competes with the supraspinatus for size. But it's right on this lateral aspect of the scapula. It's kind of on this back pocket of the shoulder. So if we use Homer here to point this out a little bit easier. Okay, let's get you to hold still, Homer. It's going to be right back here. So the infraspinatus was in this area. The Teres Minor is right on this area here. And so what happens is that muscle, it crosses from the outside edge of the scapula, and then it comes and attaches basically behind your infraspinatus. And they actually kind of work together, and just depending on the variation of your arm position. So the final rotator cuff muscle, it's called the subscapularis. So again, if we're looking on the front side of the shoulder, okay, this is where the subscapularis lives. And it actually covers pretty much the whole front surface of the scapula. It is the largest muscle of the rotator cuff. And as it travels medially to attach onto, to attach onto the anterior part of the humerus, it's going to be helping with motions like pulling in. And pulling into the body is certainly easier than pushing away from the body. And because that muscle is so big, the attachment site that it has on the humerus is 3 times larger than any other footprint of the tendon of the rotator cuff. So collectively, it forms, as the name implies, a cuff around the shoulder, rotator cuff. Its primary function is to keep the ball in close connection with the cup of the scapula. So the function of the rotator cuff is very important for healthy shoulder function, basically. And what happens with the rotator cuff, as we just explained, the tendons insert around the top of the humerus, creating this cuff, okay, right on the outside of the ball here. And when these muscles contract, it's not just when you move one way or you move another way. It's always. Rotator cuff is always active, even when you squeeze your hand. Squeezing your hand has been found to increase your rotator cuff activity. So if I were to use my hands as a representation, here is the cup of the shoulder, and then here's the ball of the shoulder. So when I move my arm, and here's the bottom part of, say, here's my hand, all right, in this example, and I go to raise my hand up, see what's happening with that ball. So that ball is spinning inside the cup. So what keeps that ball in the center of the cup? Well, as you might imagine, it's the rotator cuff. So the rotator cuff holds the ball in the center of the socket. So when you use the larger muscles like your deltoid or your biceps to help move your arm, that ball is trying to be held put in a central position so it can pivot on a congruent surface and a midpoint axis of that cup. And when that happens, we have smooth, full, pain-free range of motion and function.